Okay, well, thank you so much for being very tolerant of that start. I think this is quite interesting just in itself, the complexity of the digital, these systems, the incompatibilities, the kind of problematics of trying to use the digital in the university is kind of really part of the talk I'm giving today. So in a kind of micro study, we've just had quite a nice metaphor for the difficulties we'll encounter, and I think we'll encounter in the future. So today I'm going to be talking about the Digital Research University as an idea, as a kind of shape for the university. And I'm also going to talk to questions of artificial intelligence, which is so much in the air at the moment, and think about some of the kind of interesting aspects of that in relation to what the university is and what the university does, and really connect this a little bit to the end of the university. Now, it's kind of a strange lecture, really, because it's kind of trying to do a lot of things. So I hope it will kind of make sense. It's kind of in three parts, I would say. Really, what I'm trying to think about is really how the university, the philosophy of a university, and digitality come together in quite an interesting constellation. Now, to put this in context, the university has been transformed quite dramatically over the course of the 20th century, coming into the 21st century. And what a university is and what a university is for is, of course, a highly contested issue. The university, conceived as a space separate from everyday life, conceptualised as a place where one is able to think and reflect, perhaps step away from the everyday bustle of life, is certainly an important part of the history of a university. And even in the 1960s, when Sussex was founded, the motto of the University of Sussex was "Be still and know," essentially indicating that you are stepping out of the bustle of life and you should be able to critique and think. There was a kind of Cartesian notion that lies behind that fragment of a biblical phrase. Now, of course, the political economy of modern states has pressured the universities in multiple directions, particularly over the course of the 20th century. And this is happening again, I think, at new intensity in the 21st century, both in terms of expansion of the university, expansion of student numbers, but also in the way in which knowledge is conceived as actually a resource for the economy in and of itself. And of course, the university, as being a site both of education, training, and knowledge, its core function, the preservation and cultivation and development of knowledge, becomes really an important part of industrial policy writ large. So this really comes to a head where the university's old founding ideals, the old notion of what a university is, becomes really under strain in many ways. Clark Kerr famously said, "We don't have a university anymore, we have a multiversity," indicating the kind of multiple, really fragmentary pressures on the university idea and what a university can be. And Bill Reddings famously said in the 1990s that the university is in ruins, which is, of course, very interesting in the idea that it somehow has lost sense of itself. It's lost sense of its identity, both its corporate identity, but also its collegial identity. Now, the interesting thing about the history of the university is how cyclical it is, how things repeat themselves again and again in very interesting ways, I think. And so Hutchins, back in the 1920s, was already remarking on the difficulty of thinking of a unificatory idea for the university, and he declared that the modern university was a set of schools and departments held together by a central heating system. And he's only kind of joking here. Clark Kerr famously updated this notion in the 1960s by saying that the modern university is a series of individual faculty entrepreneurs held together by a common grievance over car parking. At Sussex, that one still holds, actually. And today, I mean, it's very interesting to think about what it is that holds our universities together. Now, of course, I'm going to argue that to a large extent now, it's computation. Computation is that commonality that increasingly brings different departments together, brings different faculties together, brings different disciplinary knowledges together, not just in terms of spreadsheets, email, and the use of Turnitin, which of course we all probably hate, but also in terms of the kinds of methods, approaches, even styles of thought, as it were, thought styles in a Mannheimian sense, that we increasingly tend to develop. So it's very important we understand this movement, this tradition, and connect it. I think Gibbons does a really interesting job of thinking about this move from a kind of mode 1 disciplinary knowledge, the traditional knowledge structure of the university, to a mode 2 interdisciplinary mode. And with our kind of data-intensive knowledge milieu, the question really is there a new formulation needed here? Is there a kind of mode 3 knowledge? And I'll leave that hanging as something that runs throughout the talk. So what is the university, or indeed what is the idea of a university under computation? Now what I'm going to do is run quickly through, I say quickly, I always say quickly, but often what happens is they run out of time, but I'll try to run quite quickly through a kind of broad brush history of the kind of key moments in the university, certainly in terms of this kind of wider conceptualization. And the idea really is to give a sense of the map of what a university is. One of the most interesting things to me is when I started doing this project many years ago, a senior colleague said to me, you must remember that no faculty are interested in the history of the university. Any talk you give on the university will have almost no one attend. And actually in the early days that was certainly true, because for some reason, and quite strangely, academics tend not to be that interested in their own institutions, like the history of their institutions, how they're formulated, how they came to be. And I find that quite interesting, particularly in terms of the archival records of a university. But anyway, so if you were thinking this was going to be something else, I'm sorry. But it is going to talk about these kind of historical ideas. Now, I am working at quite an abstract level of analysis because I am interested in conceptualizations. I will mention particular universities that are paradigmatic or exemplars of what I think are important moments of thinking about these kinds of questions. And, you can see here that there is a value orientation in the work I'm presenting. I'm interested in how the university is justified and legitimated discursively by connecting together a constellation of not just ideas and concepts, but actually values and practices. So, essentially, it goes without saying, the university has a long history. The history starts in Bologna. It starts with a particular, I suppose there's a dual birth of the universities, both in terms of the University of Paris and the University of Bologna, where you get, on one strand, the universities that are run by the students, and on the other, the universities are run by the academics, as we would now call them, the masters, as they were then. And really, these kind of tensions constantly run through the university. And it's kind of interesting when colleagues tell me, oh, the students should have more input into the university, or faculty should have more input. And it's interesting that this old idea is constantly rehearsed and replayed in interesting ways. But what I want to do is position this kind of history, and I won't be going back as far as the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries in this talk, but what I do want to do is try to position some of these kind of later questions as they develop into a set of, I think, critical research questions about really how the university has to reorient itself, reconceptualize itself in the digital age. And that's because I think, and I was talking to Nigel in the car about this, the changing nature of the universities and the fragmentary nature of the university seems to be intensifying. It is harder to develop notions of collegiality today. We are encouraged more and more to be separate and disconnected. And actually, the connections come through a kind of corporatization of the university in terms of research grant acquisition, in terms of project-based research, and so on and so forth, which are, of course, mode 2 knowledge that Gibbons was originally theorizing. The other thing that I think is quite interesting, and this is very fascinating as we go into an election campaign where there's a real attack on the universities, is the constant return of the philosophy of utility. So essentially a kind of utilitarianism that at particular moments of crisis in the university get pulled out either to attack or defend the university. I'm always quite depressed when my colleagues or the VCs defend the university through a utilitarian position. They seem quite worried about any other justification. But anyway, I think that's kind of interesting to think about this in relation to this notion of the idea of the university. And I think, as you're probably guessing, I am quite taken, and I think it's quite important to have an idea or ideas of a university. I think legitimating and able to justify the university, both inside and outside the university, is one of the things that we really need to develop, particularly under conditions today where over 60 universities are going through, some of them very brutal restructuring processes. So by its very nature, this is in a sense a kind of genealogy, but it's really a genealogy that's conceptual in nature. And that question really, to return to Reading's claim, is how we actually reclaim the university from its so-called ruins. How do we build on the ruins of the university, as it were? So the first thing to note, actually, is that the idea of a university, even though there's usually a single conceptualization, the idea of a university, paradoxically, there are numerous numbers of them. And actually, when you talk to faculty, they're often not clear that there are different justifications happening at any moment. I sit in departmental meetings where there can be an argument over what a department should do, but there's a misunderstanding about what's happening when people are, claiming that a university should, for example, become more vocational, or a university should become more research-led, or a university should develop in some other way. And that's kind of very interesting that, the kind of approach to the criticality of deconstructing, as it were, the idea of university, paradoxically is not really part of our DNA, I think. The other thing that's very interesting about the notion of an idea of a university is really that it's a regulatory ideal. And that I find very, very fascinating. And even if you're in a situation where a department is torn between multiple ideas of a university, that regulatory ideal can be quite intense. And even it can stick around for quite a long time. We think about universities having different kinds of, as it were, personalities. And as I travel around lots of different universities in my research, one of the things I'm absolutely fascinated by is how the kind of origin stories of universities, their early construction, the forces that drove them, the individuals that were so key to their founding, still somehow have some kind of effect or impact on the universities even today. My main case study at the moment, I've recently published a paper on the history of the concept of the University of Sussex, and the debates pre the foundation of the university in the 1940s and 1950s. And in fact, Sussex actually was very nearly founded in 1911, and if it wasn't for the First World War, which caused it to be cancelled as a project, it would have been in existence for much longer than it actually was. It actually was founded twice, as it were, both in 1959 and 1961. And again, there's a very interesting dimension to the character of Sussex. It has this kind of interesting bifurcation and tension, as it were. So the regulatory aspect, I think, is very, very interesting. And it's quite interesting to bring those back into visibility in both a kind of more general, abstract, philosophical sense, but also in a particular sense of a particular university. Now, this notion of an idea of university, we could say, and certainly in the literature, there's a tendency to connect this to, for example, Edmund Burke, particularly his notion of the spirit of institutions, and also with Coleridge, and Coleridge's idea that there is a kind of essence. He's got a kind of Hegelian notion of essence that is so key to an institution and really helps define what that institution is. Now, these two sources become really important because they are really, firstly, often under, how will I put this? They tend not to be explicit in the genealogy of the universities. And as we'll see shortly, this is quite interesting because this certain way of structuring the formation of the idea of a university, how the construction of the constellation of ideas that becomes so important, really continues to have such a great effect. It's very, very fascinating. So Coleridge becomes very influential on John Henry Newman. John Henry Newman is really the key starting point for that conceptualization of the idea of a university. But his sources that he's drawing on in contradiction to a kind of utilitarianism that's coming out of Mill, etc., it's just very, very fascinating. And of course, John Henry Newman has this kind of weird as it were, abstracted Oxbridge College idea in his head as he is formulating his own idea of what a university is. Now, one of the most interesting things about Newman is he really takes this idea of a core idea, a historical understanding, or a special responsibility that institutions of education have, and they have to somehow mobilise this and transmit this. And so for Newman, he starts to develop this notion of the genius loci, this idea that there's a spirit of a particular university, or in this case, a college within Oxford. And this really forms an incredibly strong and powerful idea of a university. So strong and powerful, and I probably won't have time to go into this, that it creates a distorting effect on American universities, particularly refounding of universities, but many restructurings of the universities that take place after the 1920s are essentially hugely influenced by Newman, who of course is working with this rather odd structure of Oxford. And we might come back to that. So what is this idea? Well, of course, it's the college notion, it's communal life, it's really tradition, it's the idea that there's a kind of identity with which character is formed in the student, and the idea that essentially a kind of faculty theorization of mind, that one strengthens the different faculties of mind in particular ways, cultivation of the faculties, as it were, mental training, piety, and really the development of judgment in a very English sense. So what's the college for? It's to produce English gentlemen, essentially. This is what lies at the basis of Newman's idea. And of course what happens is that gets translated, particularly in a kind of democratic tradition, into the good citizen later, particularly in America. But we get lots of experimentation going on. So of course the wonderful founding of University College London as a non-denominational and secular Minerva under gaslights, seen at the time as a very dangerous idea, full of temptation for students, because there wasn't a collegial identity to give those students character. And also founded, of course, by Jeremy Bentham. So utilitarianism is really important, underlying UCL. And of course, I'm sure you all know the story of Bentham, who required, I forget the term, is it anchorite? I think he's an anchorite. So he required that on his death, he was stuffed and placed in UCL in the atrium, so that students could also always see him. And he's still there to this day, if you're interested. UCL was founded at the same time, roughly, as King's College London. King's College London, religious, monarchical, UCL, utilitarian, rational, as it were. And even today, there's a strong tradition of competitiveness between the two universities. You may know, a slight digression, but you may know the story that the King's students used to steal the head of Jeremy Bentham in varsity or in rag, and the famous case that one year they stole his head, held it to ransom, and played football with it. And therefore, when UCL finally paid the ransom and received his head back, now keep his head in, I think, the Vice-Chancellor's office in a safe, which I always find quite a strange thing to inherit as a Vice-Chancellor, but there you go. That's utilitarianism for you. So this idea of a different kind of university, geared more towards kind of what we would call a kind of vocationalism, and less to this kind of character-building dimension. Now these ideas, the utilitarianism, the disciplinary tradition, the pietism that comes out in the collegial tradition, really start to get taken up in the US in really interesting ways. Don't have time really to go into these, but it's really fascinating how these ideas start to travel and move around in really, really interesting ways. So Eliot at Harvard, for example, doing very interesting things in terms of the structure of a university, what are students to do, how are they to understand their own, the power over their own education. So of course this is where the elective starts to become developed. Simultaneously in Germany, and this is very important, in Germany we get the notion of a national culture mediated through the research university. The research university, a powerhouse really of research. So crucially important, particularly to Americans who couldn't study PhDs in the US. So lots and lots of Americans would go to these German universities and come back with this notion of research, the research idea of a university, and also actually very influential eventually on the reconstruction or the revolution, if you like, at Oxford and Cambridge, where endowments were, well, essentially Oxford and Cambridge had become very corrupt in the 1800s, and people essentially sat around drinking port and gambling, and the UK Parliament eventually had to step in and essentially use many of the notions from the German universities to restructure the English universities. So that's very important in terms of this story. So we get this notion that a university, Humboldtian notion, that essentially the university should be structured around research. And here we get a strong break with the English notion, and it's not so much a college education, it's now a departmental education that becomes important. The department becomes the key aspect. And of course, the professor as the the leader of the department as well becomes very, very important in the structuring, but also in terms of a disciplinary notion. Now, this is important because Oxford and Cambridge didn't really do research as we would think of research. It was considered kind of embarrassing. There's some wonderful stories about scientists trying to cobble together research laboratories at Oxford and Cambridge, and paying for them with their own money, and all sorts of strange things that had to be done because it didn't fit the picture of a collegiate universities. But in Germany, we see methods and methodological skills, analytical and theoretical knowledge, and mobilized through a new form of teaching, the seminar, where the student could see research in action, and also really see how one undertook the practice of research more generally. Now, what's kind of interesting at this point is the American universities, with this dual influence, try to bring these conflicting, tension-ridden elements together in the American research universities, which is and remains a highly unstable aggregate. And the history, which I just don't have time to go into, unfortunately, but Chicago is a wonderful case study of how do you really bring together essentially undergraduate education and graduate level, postgraduate level research in a university. They're completely conflictual. They conflict the faculty. They conflict the very idea of what a university is. And this remains to today, right? Many of us see these restructurings going on, and many of the restructurings are driven by different dynamics coming out of these formulations in very interesting ways. But this American structure, which we haven't actually inherited fully in Britain, we tend to have a much more messy structure, I think, in the way which we bring together these elements. But the American structure, that there is this undergraduate college, and then there are the kind of professional schools, creating this kind of clarity in terms of the different responsibilities, although obviously tension-ridden, has been incredibly powerful. The American universities are the powerhouses of research. And in fact, in many ways, what we're seeing now in terms of the restructuring, I would argue, is the re-importation into Britain of ideas that were developed here, the collegial notion of the university, together with this German notion, mediated through America, back to us. So I wonder if we are going to end up with quite Americanized structures when we finally go through this kind of cycle. So what the American universities really did was really transform a connection between a university and a political economy. And that happened very much over the course of the 20th century, where money was flowing partially because of the Cold War, but also because of much private funding philanthropy in the US, which shaped the university structures in really dramatic ways. For instance, institutes and research centres in the US. And of course, this produced some rather remarkable fundamental and practical research findings. So this is very interesting to show how we're in a space which is highly tension-ridden, highly vibrant and unstable in interesting ways. So I want to kind of sort of develop these themes and think of them now in terms of our kind of moment of digitality and how we can think of them. Now, one of the things I do like in the literature, and I like the way historically people try to create metaphors around what the university is, or they think of similes, or they create interesting stories. And I've collected this from a number of different pieces that I've read over the last sort of 5 years or so, just to give you a kind of sense of how this plays itself out. So the Oxford colleges, for example, self-contained communities around quads, the Merton idea, the notion of the garden, cultivation, these kind of ideas strongly linked to or underlying the notion of what it is to teach. Berkeley and Sussex, the notion of the campus obviously imported in the 1960s in a rather interesting way into Britain through the plate glass universities, the 7 plate glass universities. The city of learning, as it were. Again, that metaphor is quite interesting. Pittsburgh, the cathedral of learning with a 42-floor vertical tower. Michigan State University, the development of academic corridors. I just think these are so interesting as ideas. And this was very fascinating. The University of Illinois at Chicago, that the university is like a stone dropped in a pond of water with concentric rings of knowledge dissipating out of the centre. Very interesting. And then lastly, this question of the digital university, and for example, Frederick Kittler has theorised the university as an information processor, as a kind of computer. And again, that you see that metaphor quite a lot. The university as a platform, the university as a kind of software service in some way. Rather strange, but very interesting. And of course, we're seeing really dramatic changes in the political economy of the UK higher education. Clearly, you know, the way in which money is flowing around higher education is changing in really quite uncomfortable ways. We're really not sure what's going to happen. And of course, I want to link this to the need for a new conceptualization and justification in relation to these new changes. Because, you know, there is a story to be told. I think there is an important contribution the universities make. And it's not just that utilitarian notion that has become so predominant. It's not just about getting jobs. There's much more to it. And I want to connect that to the kind of digital intensive methodologies and more generally to kind of digitality itself. So as we've seen, right, there are certain kinds of institutional structures, there are certain kinds of conceptualizations that are operationalized within the university. And one of the most profound has been the development of the department out of Germany via the US and then flowing around the system. And these have been very, very successful, there's no doubt about it, both in terms of fundamental research and practical research. But you can see, I think, now why I talk about this kind of bifurcation between the educational and research missions of a university. Right? This is a really interesting tension in how one does it. So this is, of course, this notion of the Oxford College, this model of undergraduate education, which we see all the time in discussions of the education experience, student experience, all these kinds of stories that we hear people talking about. It doesn't often get articulated in this way, but essentially that's what's happening. And that, of course, of the German research university, the importance of research, the importance of ref, the importance of impact. And of course, for any academic trying to negotiate this field, it's a complete nightmare as you're pulled constantly. In fact, there's often a TikTok where you're being pulled towards the collegial undergraduate education, and then 2 years later, you're being told, no, drop all that. Now we're focusing on research and reference and so forth. So this tension is very interesting. And in fact, as I said previously, Chicago is actually a very interesting case study because of the way in which you have this kind of micro study of these tensions playing out in very, very interesting ways. Now, this tension was highly mobilized after the Second World War in very interesting ways, and was used to justify the creation of something new, something that could transcend this tension, This was, of course, the plate glass universities. Sussex was the first. And the idea really that something was wrong with this system. Something was wrong with these colleges, this collegial notion. Something was wrong with these research departments. And actually what you needed was some kind of new formation. At Sussex, it was the schools of study. At York, it was a new kind of college. And the other plate glass universities, they had their own sort of take on it. They may use the same words, like schools at Essex, for example, but it wasn't like schools at Sussex. They were all kind of strange and diverse structures. And, you know, in many ways, very, very successful, right? Very, very successful. Turns out they were very, very expensive, which will become a big problem later on, of course, when the government removes all the funding. But nonetheless, very interesting as a case study. Now, of course, as I said, we're in this situation where we have this challenge from digitality. And this challenge really comes at multiple levels. I mean, it's both political, economic, but it's also in terms of the demands of students wanting to have some kind of digital knowledge, digital skills, digital understanding. They may be called digital natives, but you'd be surprised how little undergraduates know about the digital, how little they understand what Google is, how Google works, even how to do a Google search. It's one of the interesting things I find about teaching students about digital studies in and of itself. But of course, what you've got as well is a different kind of research structure emerging as well, where digitality has become very foundational to doing research at all, right? So we don't have chemistry, we have informatic chemistry, or we have computational chemistry, or we have computational biology, we have computational humanities, or the digital humanities. And what, of course, is the key point here is you've got this, essentially, digitality that becomes really fundamental. And of course, if digitality in and of itself becomes fundamental, you get this crossover of methodology. You get this crossover of a kind of, as it were, medium specificity, where everyone seems to be working with this kind of strange form of the digital. So when I have conversations, for example, with astrophysicists, suddenly their research starts to make sense when you're doing very large corpus analysis, because we're kind of both looking for patterns. It's kind of a strange thing. So you get this rather odd movement of methodologies. And almost like the dream of the 1960s interdisciplinarity seems to be promised by digitality. But of course, we have to be careful, because it's tempting to assume, therefore, that digitality is in and of itself neutral, which of course it's not. It obscures and hides as much as it reveals. So very important that we also are critical about these technologies. And of course, artificial intelligence suddenly jumped onto our radar in 2022, and the incredible advances between 2022, 2023 and 2024. My teaching is a nightmare at the moment, because the advances move so fast, and the resolution of the quality, the granularity of the quality that comes out of these systems. Each year I'm having to update my slides with, you know, just with incredible leaps in the capacities of these systems. And these really allow not just the automated production of textual, image and video, but also new methodological possibilities, new ways of working with traditional materials, or even historical materials or archival materials, new questions. And of course, they have their own kind of problematics as well. Now, the digital has been promised, and it's very interesting in terms of kind of a kind of ideology critique. The digital has promised, or the advocates of the digital have promised, prosperity for all, knowledge for all, through a digital revolution. But of course, there is unprecedented prosperity for certain parts of society, but it's clear the digitality is not equally distributed. We are seeing really large inequality in relation to the way in which money flows around a society, and many distortions from that, which we are now starting to have to face up to. Just think about the elections on their own. The fact that billionaires are so keen to own social media platforms and control the discussion and debate and the ideas in society shows you the power of these new systems. So this, I think, to come back to this question of university, right, we are supposed to be able to negotiate these complex knowledge milieus, and yet in some ways we really lack an ability to deal with this. The difficulty we have is kind of somehow connecting to digitality. Why is that? And how can we do something about it? You know, you'd think the universities would be much more agile, I guess, than they actually are. And I would argue that, you know, having, you know, I'm not sure the word is, developed, grown older, through the university as a teacher and a lecturer and a reader and now a professor, I have seen this transformation. I remember when I used to give talks about digitality and computation in the humanities back in the day, people would tell me that this was boring, that it wasn't really very interesting research. But of course, 20 years later, it now suddenly doesn't seem so strange and esoteric. So the university, you know, even if we just think of the fundamental transformations in its kind of like infrastructural form, is profound. But it's not just there, it's transforming publication, it's transforming disciplinary knowledge, it's transforming methodologies, it's transforming even the way people conceptualize research, how research is not only done, but thought, right? The digitality, as it were, creates certain kinds of frames that are actually not understood well, right? As these systems get rolled out and used, right, they really shape knowledge in very particular ways. And here I'm thinking, for example, of how we apply for, say, research grants with very formulaic structures and templates. Templates are a particular hate of mine. Pro formas, Word documents, spreadsheet documents, and so on and so forth. And that's very, very interesting if you want to think about the kind of criticality that the university should have. But actually, in terms of teaching, things have changed dramatically. You know, I remember when, you know, we had to print all the handbooks that you gave to students. Students wouldn't accept a website. They wouldn't accept a digital version. That was somehow a cheap and nasty way of giving information to students. And then suddenly, one day, printed handbooks were abolished. Very, very interesting. Lecture capture, PDFs. Think about all the ways in which our knowledge is changing because of this digitality, and how fast it's happening that we don't get time to catch our breath in relation to these new mediums of knowledge. So I think the university definitely has to think about these kind of changes in very important ways, but also get ahead of them, because, you know, our job is knowledge at the end of the day. And this will be very important, of course, in the way in which the income into the university shifts the political economy, the very basic factors that make the university possible at all. As digitality transforms the economy, transforms knowledge, we have to adapt to them. Hopefully not in a way in which we don't lose our soul, as it were. We don't lose that kind of genius loci. But actually, we orient ourselves in a way in which we can, you know, take the best of the digital and the best of the traditional research university in order to offer a new kind of intensivity, perhaps a digital intensivity that opens up new ways of seeing, new methods for undertaking research, new ways of teaching, new ways of thinking. One way I've been thinking about this is Asa Briggs famously came up with a very inspirational idea of new maps of learning, and that the plate glass universities would be the place to have these new maps of learning created. Of course, what he's got there is a geographical, spatial metaphor for thinking about this change. And it was an it's an anti-departmental knowledge idea that he had. It's very interesting to see how much he hated departments when you read his writing. It's quite hard, I think, from this time so far away from when he was writing, how much he hated departments, and how much departments were hated way back in the 1960s. But maybe we can think of this in a new way, in a more temporal way, as kind of trajectories of learning, that the digital opens up this rather than a spatial metaphor, a kind of temporal metaphor, as it were. And how this can feed then into how we present our teaching in the university, how we can actually communicate these new knowledge forms. So one way, these are now my sort of ideas that I'm kind of working through at the moment. One way I've been thinking about this is, for example, I mean, one of the possibilities opened up by digitality is kind of new ways of virtualizing things. And virtualizing things, you know, doesn't have to be very thin, right? And certainly, you know, I think today, seeing how people use social media, they use the digital as an aspect of their lives, you wouldn't think of it as a kind of thin experience. You know, in some ways it's an extremely full experience. If you think of TikTok and the way in which that is used. But really, I have this notion of a kind of digital college and digital schools that really allow us to somehow rethink and reuse ideas of the past in interesting ways. So, for example, by connecting back to some of these ways of thinking about student experience, we can essentially restructure the way in which we present the university, perhaps reconnecting to a notion of service, connected to a notion of a college, connected to a notion of a public university. And of course, correspondingly to citizenship, civil society and democracy. So I'm just going to throw that up because that's my kind of latest way of thinking about this, really. And you can see what I'm taking is a very standardized notion of departmental structure, sometimes done through boards of study. And then what you can do with these kind of digital possibilities is layer on these kinds of collegial structures on top using digitality, but also help you to develop interdisciplinary studies, which is so difficult to do when you have this kind of boards of study or departmental structure. So I just wanted to flash that up so you can see what I'm thinking. And of course, when you have this new structure of the university, it allows you really to sort of take in and use many kind of aspects of digitality that at the moment it's quite hard to incorporate, both in terms of the tension that we feel between undergraduate and research cultures, but also in terms of the methodologies, the forms, the possibilities, the connection to student experience, bringing back the kind of idea of a specificity to student life, so that it's not this sort of what used to be described as red brick experience, which is anonymous and students feel lost, etc. So to connect it back to Newman, essentially, through this kind of co-location in the college. Similarly, with this notion of digital schools, if you know your Asa Briggs, you'll see that what I've done there is take Asa Briggs' notion of the horizontality of the school idea, and I have this idea of kind of pop-up fields that are encouraged by this kind of school structure, which is mediated through these possibilities in digitality. And here I'm just saying this was a founding idea of Sussex. It turned out the schools of study at Sussex was phenomenally expensive and complex because, of course, they did it all on paper. So it was extremely difficult to do. But now, with digitality, it makes these things much more possible. Okay, and my last little bit, I know I'm getting close to the end of time. I just want to quickly just talk a little bit about how this feeds into the kind of work in my field and show how digitality is really transforming things. The so-called computational turn of the humanities, it's the idea of the application or use of digital technologies in humanities research. It's kind of, it was founded as a field in 2001, although it has much older histories, which are interesting, but maybe that will be something someone won't be interested in questions. But really the idea of how we can use these kind of digital methods, digital mediums, digital possibilities to sort of look at humanities materials in new ways. I just want to flash this up very quickly. Thinking about the kinds of things we need in digital humanities, they're not all there yet. In fact, we don't really have a digital humanities BA in existence yet, although we're getting closer and closer as we start to fill in these things. But anyway, that gives you a sense of the range of things that need to be kind of incorporated in some sense. I don't want to go through the history of digital humanities. I will say that it has been very interesting to be in this field as it developed. It has been absolutely fascinating to track the kind of problematic that digitality bring to humanities knowledge, because digitality, in a sense, is very easily allied with instrumental utilitarianism. And so when you think about the kinds of hermeneutic ways of working with materials that are encouraged in the humanities, there's a real tension when trying to combine those with digital approaches. And I think that writ large is a nice way of thinking about the problem for the university more generally. And of course, artificial intelligence. We really are in the revolutionary moment of artificial intelligence. All sorts of challenges for us, not just in the humanities, but across the entire university. And so I just want to show you a few quick projects, really to show you how these kind of quite techie things can be quite interesting. But I also want to just highlight this wonderful point that when we use these very interesting and powerful systems, you do have to be very, very careful. One of my favourite findings from the application of artificial intelligence to a large textual corpus was that PDF was the most statistically important feature when they were analysing the English broadside ballads, for example, which I just found very humorous as an outcome. So you've probably seen some of these before, but this is a good example of machine vision and classification being used. So you can automate, for example, the classification of these woodcuts, and it has opened up whole arenas for research. It's connected to new ways of thinking about these in really fascinating ways. And it has also allowed images to be found where they didn't know they existed previously. Textual analysis in very interesting ways. Typeface analysis has also come out of this project. So really, I should explain why you would use this for those who are not humanities scholars. So if you look at the image, the question always was, what is the woman holding? Because it needs to be classified so it's searchable. And of course, different humans would have different views. Some would say a fan, some would say a flower, some would say cabbage, some would say, I don't know, an artichoke or something. And of course, that causes huge problems when you're trying to do a big research project when there are hundreds or thousands of images that need to be accessed. Another good example of this is the Dead Sea Scrolls and the use of computational techniques to unwrap things that were burnt or charred in some way using various forms of computational techniques. And these have advanced quite dramatically, and there are new ways of, for example, fitting charred fragments of ancient texts together. It also turns out that when they were burnt, ink burns slightly different to parapus, which means that we can't see these, but the computers can see the text in these images. And we may find some really remarkable texts over the coming years. This is what they look like, for example. Absolutely charred beyond belief. Some of them are in fragments, but scanning them, and I should say many people have tried to unwrap these using all sorts of techniques since the sort of 1700s, and it's only very recently that we've been able to do this by using digital techniques in the digital humanities. Allied with machine learning, you can actually read the scrolls and essentially translate them in real time. So this really kind of opens up all sorts of possibilities. And you can see here they use a particle accelerator to scan. Again, you see this interdisciplinarity, this shared research infrastructure that also is very interesting. And here's just another example of this kind of scanning technique that allows you to see these texts for the first time. This is one of my favourite. This was the known as the Night Watch. It's a painting from 1639. I like it because of the strange way it develops, which is that it used to be rather large. The full blue is the entire size of the image, but it was moved between two different buildings, and when they moved it, it wouldn't fit on the wall between two doors. So, being very practical fellows, they just sawed off the corners and the top and bottom where they wouldn't fit and just threw them away. And of course, it raises the question, well, what's missing? Well, luckily there was a very poor quality copy of it, and using artificial intelligence, they've been able to basically hallucinate back the missing parts of the image, which is kind of a really wonderful use of artificial intelligence in a kind of art historical project. Now, of course, when you do this, you always have to be careful because there is a hallucinatory dimension to it. And the truth machine of the computer, the way in which we think the output of the computer is so truthful, we have to be very, very careful. But nonetheless, it's very suggestive of what you can do. So these kinds of technologies are certainly going to become quite profound. One of the things I'm very interested in is the way in which some of these LLMs, because of their conversational nature, generate very interesting possibilities for research practice. I worked with some biblical scholars who were complete novices at computer programming, but had access to a quite sophisticated API access to, which is a computational term for accessing data via the internet. They couldn't do any of that stuff. But using ChatGPT, they could just say, please, could you extract such and such data from a such and such version of the Bible using such and such API at such and such library, and the computer just creates the source code for them to run it, extract the data from the archives if it's digitized, and then they can even ask ChatGPT to create the programming to do the analysis. Really quite remarkable in what you can do. And the other side of it, which is very, very fascinating, and I've been working with students on this, is using persona of the artificial intelligence systems. By training them on historical works, you can actually step into the texts and so have a conversation, say, with Odysseus, and ask questions about what that person can see at any particular time in the text. There's actually quite a wonderful new system called ChatPDF. Some of you may have seen it. It's quite wonderful to show your students, where they can drag and drop a PDF you've assigned to them and then have a conversation with the PDF about what the research is in the paper. Really rather profound and rather strange for us to think of. But anyway, in terms of methodology and questions and creativity in methodology, there are lots of potentials here. And I haven't really got time to talk about the creative possibilities. I mean, you know, it's really quite remarkable for creative practitioners. However, I do want to continually say these systems do hallucinate. You know, we do have to be very, very careful when we work with these systems. So I think they're very intriguing. They open up all sorts of very interesting possibilities. And, you know, there's no doubt about it in terms of like digital methods, where I'm quite interested in what you can do. They are really fascinating for working with students. They certainly democratize many very complicated methods. For example, I've worked with students on developing topic modelling, and that's a very complicated thing to do. It's very complex for students to understand, but you can get these systems to just do topic modelling on the fly, and so it becomes a much more manageable method for students working through, for example, undergraduate dissertations. And I suppose I should also connect this back to the importance, really, of reflexivity in the work we're doing. I mean, you know, there are wonderful possibilities suggested by these methods, these approaches, and so on and so forth. And we do have to have critical approaches to them, and that's really also an important part of the Digital Research University in and of itself as a critical actor in society, where we are rushing headlong into a kind of Californian ideology of unrestricted accelerationism and digitality. Okay, so this stuff is very interesting. There's so many possibilities for thinking about these questions. It's a very fascinating area. I mean, just thinking about copyright alone is a remarkable conversation which we can't talk about here, but I'll just point you towards it because I think it's genuinely quite fascinating. And in terms of criticality, I just want to just highlight some of the kinds of problematics that have been discovered in these systems, which are very interesting, particularly when you do develop narratives using, this was ChatGPT 3, it was more likely to generate masculine characters with agency, and it would generate female characters which were more passive. They would be more connected to family, emotions, and the body. I think that's kind of interesting to think about, not just in terms of the biases in these systems, which are often hard to find, but also in terms of critical readings and how we think about how we might use them in our research and teaching practices themselves. Okay, so to summarise, really, it's, you know, I think we're in a position where we really have to take account of these huge changes that are going on not just in terms of the digital, the revolution of artificial intelligence, changes in terms of student expectations, difficulties in terms of the clunky structures we often have in the university, but also the changing nature, particularly of UK higher education funding, which is coming at us like a train rapidly. The university has not been able to fully incorporate many of the possibilities, and partly it's down to structural problems, but I think also the difficulty of using corporate software, I think, is an important part of the kind of problematic, and knowledge about what it is that we want from these systems, and being told the computer won't allow you to do that is often closes down possibilities in teaching and research in really depressing ways. And I do want to sort of suggest there are quite positive potentialities for using LLMs, artificial intelligence, machine learning. Not necessarily ChatGPT, there are now a multitude of different systems, but we certainly need to be thinking about university foundation models. That's not something that's talked about a lot. They're very corporate, they're proprietary on the whole, but do we need in the universities to sort of think about picking up some of these things and developing our own for the kinds of work that we want to do? Okay, I shall finish there. Thank you very much indeed.